Black CEO, mocked by billionaire white family. 10 minutes later, she erased their $4.9b deal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You don't belong here. The words sharp, icy, flung with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life, cut across the ballroom like a blade skidding over crystal. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused mid-air. Even the chandelier above seemed to flicker, as if startled by the venom in the woman's voice. At the center of that golden room stood a tall black woman in a minimalist satin orange gown, phone lifted loosely to her ear. Her posture didn't shift. Her breathing didn't falter. She simply stared ahead, as calm and composed as the still surface of a lake minutes before a storm. Around her, the crowd, men in tuxedos, women in midnight blue silk and sequin gowns, turned in unison, pulled by the irresistible gravity of humiliation. Opposite her stood the source of the outburst. A woman in a blazing red dress, blonde hair sculpted into a sleek bob, her fingers stabbing the air as if authority lived in her wrist. Her face contorted with a kind of righteous fury reserved for people convinced the universe itself answered to their family name. "I said you don't belong here," she repeated, louder now, her voice cracking with entitlement. "This section is for invited guests, not strays. It's even tenesech to this creation." A murmur rippled across the hall. Some guests smiled the way people smile when cruelty entertains them. Others lifted their phones, attempting to hide their recording behind polite, guilty curiosity. A man near the back whispered, "Oh no, she's doing this in front of everyone." His partner nudged him, eyes wide, but she didn't look away. The black woman lowered her phone. Slowly, deliberately, her expression unreadable. The blonde woman scoffed and stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor like small acts of violence. "Don't just stand there pretending you didn't hear me," she hissed, her voice dripping with theatrical disgust. "People like you don't just walk into a gala like this. Who let you in? Security must be asleep." The words "people like you" landed heavier than the rest. The insult wasn't just about status, it was about color. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. The tension crawled across the ballroom like electricity searching for a place to strike. But the woman in orange didn't flinch. She simply blinked once, slow, serene, and shifted her gaze from the aggressor to the glittering hall around them. Her eyes moved across the sea of suited men and elegantly dressed women, across the chandeliers dripping with gold light, across the faces eager to witness someone else's public unmaking. Each stare she met flickered with the same silent question. "Who is she?" The blonde leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that somehow carried farther than a shout. "You think wearing a bright dress makes you part of this world?" she sneered. "Sweetheart, standing here doesn't make you equal to us." Snickers sprinkled across the crowd, tiny sparks of complicity. The woman in orange inhaled, not sharply, not in shock, but with the steady rhythm of someone measuring the weight of the moment. The kind of breath you take when you stand at the threshold between restraint and revelation. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. A waiter froze halfway through pouring champagne, eyes wide as the blonde lifted her chin, emboldened by the crowd's silence. "You're lucky I don't call security right now," she snapped. "In fact, maybe I should. You're ruining the atmosphere." The black woman finally moved, not toward her, not away, but with a subtle shift of posture that straightened her shoulders and revealed the quiet steel beneath her stillness. She held the phone between two fingers, as if she had been interrupted mid-decision. Her eyes lifted and locked onto the blonde's. And something in the room changed. The laughter dimmed. The whispers softened. A hush washed over the guests like a slow, inevitable tide. Even the music from the string quartet wavered, one violinist bowing out a half-second too late, as if the air itself had thickened. The orange-clad woman's gaze was not furious, not wounded, not even surprised. It was calm, cold, measured, The kind of gaze that made the most confident people question their footing. The blonde faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for a truth to flicker across her eyes. She had miscalculated. But pride is loud, and fear whispers. She leaned in one last time, her voice trembling with the need to regain control. "Whatever you think you are," she spat, "you're nothing here. Is it disfirm?" Every head in the room turned back to the woman in orange. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lift her chin. She simply closed her fingers around her phone, exhaled once, and said nothing at all. And somehow, that silence was the loudest sound the ballroom had ever heard. The silence didn't fade. It lingered heavy, charged, almost sentient, as if the chandelier's warm light itself had paused to watch what would unfold next. The woman in the orange gown remained perfectly still, a pillar of quiet dignity surrounded by marble, gold, and judgment. But beneath that serene surface, something in the atmosphere had begun to tilt. The blonde woman sensed it too, though she masked her unease with a brittle laugh. "Unbelievable," she scoffed, turning to the nearest cluster of guests. "She thinks ignoring me makes her look powerful." No one laughed with her. Not anymore. A man in a navy tux shifted uncomfortably, eyes bouncing between the two women. A woman in a black velvet dress whispered, "Why is she still pushing this?" A few guests lowered their phones, suddenly aware of how ugly the moment had become, how eagerly they had consumed it seconds earlier. But the blonde wasn't done. Humiliation, for people like her, was a fire that needed oxygen, and she was determined to breathe it back to life. She stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the marble until it nearly touched the hem of the orange gown. "I'll give you one last chance," she said, voice low but quivering. "Tell me who invited you, or I will have you escorted out." The woman in orange finally lifted her chin, not in defiance, just in acknowledgement, as if she had decided to truly look at her adversary for the first time. Her eyes were steady, dark, deep in the way oceans are deep, revealing nothing but capable of sinking everything. Around them, the quartet faltered again. One of the violinists accidentally slipped on a note, the sour sound ringing through the room like a warning. A tall man near the back, one of the gala hosts, walked forward as if to intervene. But halfway across the floor, he stopped. Something in the woman in orange's expression held him in place. He hesitated, swallowed, and turned away. The blonde noticed. Her jaw tightened. Losing an audience was worse than losing an argument. She leaned in so close their dresses nearly brushed. "What's wrong?" she whispered sharply. "Cat got your tongue? Or did you finally realize where you stand in this room?" The woman in orange didn't step back. She didn't even blink. She simply breathed a soft, steady breath that seemed to ripple through the crowd like a wind through silk curtains. Then she lowered her gaze, not to avoid the blonde's eyes, but to look past her entirely. Behind the blonde, dozens of faces stared back, exposed under the golden lights. Some guilty, some eager, some afraid, some fascinated. The quiet truth settled across the entire ballroom. They weren't just witnesses, they were participants, and suddenly, they seemed to know it. A murmur rolled across the tables, shallow, uneasy, like water sloshing in a glass that someone's hand had just trembled over. A man near the champagne tower cleared his throat. Another lowered her camera. A waiter froze, unsure whether to keep serving or retreat. The blonde turned, scanning the room that had begun slipping through her fingers. "Really?" she barked. "You're all just going to stare at me now?" "If you, probably." No one answered. It was the kind of silence that echoes, the kind born when people realize the power they thought they had is dissolving. She spun back toward the woman in orange, fury twisting her features. "Fine," she snapped. "If you won't speak, I'll speak for you. You don't belong here because you didn't earn a place here." A sharp inhale rippled through the crowd. Even the air seemed to recoil. The woman in orange lifted her eyes once more, slow, calm, and devastatingly controlled. And in that moment, before she even opened her mouth, something shifted so dramatically that even the chandeliers seemed to dim in anticipation. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match anger with anger. She simply said, in a tone so composed it felt like an indictment, "Is that truly what you believe?" The question wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet, powerful ripples across the room. And for the first time all evening, the blonde woman found herself unable to answer. The question hung in the air like a suspended blade, its edge catching the chandelier light as every eye in the ballroom shifted back to the woman in orange. She hadn't moved. She hadn't raised her voice. And yet her words carried a gravity that made even the thick velvet curtains seem to draw inward, as if the entire room were leaning closer. The blonde woman opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, struggling for a comeback that refused to appear. Her confidence, once so loud, now clattered silently like a cracked glass about to fall off the table. The woman in orange waited, not with impatience, not with arrogance, but with a patience so absolute it felt like a mirror being held up to the entire room. "You're twisting this," the blonde finally said, her voice thin. "You're trying to make me the villain here." A soft gasp flickered through the crowd because the implication was absurd, and everyone knew it. Still, people shifted uncomfortably, adjusting their posture, their collars, their glasses. It was always easier to watch a fire than to admit you had helped light it. The woman in the orange gown lowered her shoulders slightly, not in defeat, but in the kind of quiet strength that made the room feel suddenly too small for the truth pressing against its walls. "I asked a simple question," she replied, "and I'm giving you space to answer it." The blonde swallowed hard. She wanted to push back, wanted to reclaim the dominance she had enjoyed seconds earlier, but something about the steady calm in front of her made her feel like she was standing on a ledge she had never noticed before. You're making this dramatic," she muttered, stepping back half an inch. "No," the woman in orange said softly. "I'm making it clear." The crowd froze. Even the servers halted mid-stride, holding trays just above their fingertips. "Because what you said," she continued, "didn't come from confusion or a misunderstanding. It came from conviction." The blonde blinked rapidly, heat rising across her cheeks. "That's not I didn't," but the woman in orange wasn't looking at her anymore. She turned her gaze to the audience. 100 faces stared back, caught like portraits in a museum of complicity. Some tried to look away, others stiffened. A few held their breath, unsure whether they were terrified of being judged or desperate to hear what would come next. "Tell me," the woman said, voice steady, "how many of you saw what happened and thought it was normal?" Silence. "How many of you thought it was justified?" Silence. Deeper now. "How many of you laughed?" A few eyes fell to the floor, heat blooming across cheeks once smug and entertained. Her tone never shifted. She didn't accuse. She didn't condemn. She simply revealed. Revealed the truth tucked behind every sideways glance, every stifled chuckle, every phone raised not to help but to record. A voice near the back finally cracked the quiet. I didn't laugh," a woman whispered, almost pleading. The woman in orange nodded once. "Then you understood what she didn't," the blonde bristled. "Oh, please don't act like you're above all of us." "I'm not," the woman replied. "I'm simply not beneath you." The room exhaled collectively, involuntarily because the distinction was devastating. The blonde's jaw clenched. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, the red satin of her dress trembling with her breath. "You're being disrespectful," she snapped. "You're embarrassing yourself." But it wasn't the woman in orange who looked embarrassed. It was the guests, the ones who had smiled, who had whispered, who had lifted their cameras with silent approval. And the blonde saw it. Saw their shifting expressions. Saw how the room had turned from audience into mirror. Her fierce surface then sharp, unhidden. "You don't belong here," she repeated, but this time the words wobbled. They no longer sounded like a fact. They sounded like a hope, a plea, a crumbling illusion. The woman in orange stepped forward exactly 1 inch. "No more." "Then tell me," she said quietly. "Who does?" No one answered. The chandeliers flickered again, casting long shadows across the marble as if even the light was bracing for the truth that was finally forcing its way into the room. And by the time the blonde found her voice again, the balance of power had already shifted. The blonde opened her mouth, but whatever comeback she had prepared dissolved before it could form words. The room had shifted fully, unmistakably. What had begun as a spectacle was turning into something else entirely, a reckoning she had never intended to provoke and was entirely unprepared to face. For a moment she stood frozen, the red satin of her dress shimmering under the chandelier like a warning flare. But the woman in the orange gown didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't even breathe differently. Her stillness was power, quiet, unforced, elemental. And that terrified the blonde more than any raised voice ever could. "You think you're so righteous," the blonde muttered at last, but her tone betrayed her. The confidence that once strutted through her words had thinned into something fragile, something that cracked at the edges. You think you can walk in here, make a scene, and what? Scare people into pitying you? The woman in orange tilted her head slightly, the faintest gesture of curiosity. No, she said. I don't need pity, and I don't need to scare anyone. Her voice was still soft. But the softness cut deeper now. Then what do you want? The blonde demanded, though the question trembled on her lips. The woman in orange didn't answer immediately. She took her time, letting the question settle over the ballroom like dust stirring in sunlight. Her gaze swept the room past the glittering chandeliers, past the gilded pillars, past the faces trying to disappear into their collars and champagne glasses. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had lived through enough storms to know when the thunder belonged to her. I want clarity, she said. For you, for them, for this room. A murmur rippled down the line of guests as if someone had run a hand along the strings of a grand piano. The woman continued, clarity about why you thought you could humiliate me. She took a step closer, not threatening, simply closing distance like someone reclaiming their rightful space. Clarity about why everyone else thought it was entertainment. Another step gentle, deliberate, and clarity about why my presence threatened you so deeply. The blonde recoiled as if slapped, though the other woman hadn't lifted a hand. Threatened? She scoffed, but her voice pitched too high, betraying the quake running through her. You're delusional. No, the woman replied calmly. Just observant. The crowd shifted. Heat blossomed across faces. Glasses clinked softly as hands trembled, unsure where to put their guilt. Behind the blonde, a man cleared his throat. A second quietly put his phone away. A third looked at his wife as if silently asking, were we part of this too? The blonde spun toward them, eyes wide. Don't look at me like that. She's twisting everything. Her voice fractured on the last word, scattering across the ballroom like shards of broken glass. No one defended her. The woman in orange let out a quiet breath, controlled, measured. It isn't twisted, she said. It's simply true. You saw me, you judged me, and you assumed you were safe doing it. The truth landed like a slow, heavy heartbeat. The blonde's posture crumbled an inch. Her shoulders sagged. The red fabric around her waist wrinkled from the tension she could no longer hide. Why? Why are you doing this? She whispered. For the first time, her energy wasn't combative, it was bewildered. Because you asked who belongs here, the woman answered. And the only honest answer is this. She lifted her chin, eyes sweeping the ballroom once more. No one belongs in a room built on exclusion. Not even you. A collective inhale. The blonde stepped back again, heel wobbling. You can't talk to me like that. Do you know who my family is? The woman in orange's gaze sharpened not with anger, but with recognition. Yes, she said quietly. I do. She paused. And I also know what they're hiding. The blonde froze. The room froze. A violinist gasped and nearly dropped her bow. What? What is that supposed to mean? The blonde stammered, color draining from her face. The woman in orange didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Because in the silence that followed, the ballroom understood one thing with chilling clarity. The humiliation was over. The consequences were about to begin. The blonde woman's breath hitched, shallow and sharp, as if her corseted dress had suddenly tightened around her ribs. The room seemed to tilt just slightly when the woman in orange delivered those quiet words. I know what they're hiding. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. But it was enough to make every guest shift, straighten, or freeze entirely. Across the ballroom, someone whispered, What does she know? Another murmured, Is this about the merger? Transaction. Phones slipped back into purses and jackets, not because people wanted to stop recording, but because they suddenly understood the moment unfolding wasn't entertainment anymore. It was evidence. I asked you a question, the blonde forced out, her voice wobbling like a chandelier crystal during an earthquake. What do you mean by that? The woman in orange offered no immediate answer. Instead, she glanced down at the phone, still in her hand, a silent instrument that had not yet sung its final note. She turned it slowly, letting the light catch its edges, as if revealing a talisman with far more power than anyone in the room realized. When she lifted her eyes again, they were steady, focused, prepared. You've spent the night treating me like a mistake, she said softly. But I didn't walk into this room by accident. The blonde swallowed, her throat bobbing visibly. That doesn't explain anything. It will, the woman replied. Behind them, movement flickered. A man in a charcoal suit, one of the event organizers, took a few steps forward, then hesitated. A server paused mid-pour at a nearby table, eyes fixed on the exchange. A couple near the stage clasped their hands together, their fingers white at the knuckles. Everyone sensed a tremor rising under the marble floor. The woman in orange continued, her tone still calm, still devastatingly measured. "You asked who invited me." She glanced at the blonde. "You asked whether I belonged." Her gaze swept the room. "And you asked what I had earned." The blonde's breath stuttered as the crowd absorbed those words, echoes of everything she had said, now mirrored back at her with surgical precision. "Let me answer," the woman continued. But instead of directing her words to the blonde, she turned her body slightly, addressing the room itself. "I was invited by someone who understood what true partnership looks like," she said. "Someone who doesn't measure worth by skin color, clothing, or who stands closest to a chandelier." A few guests shifted, avoiding each other's eyes. "And I belong," she added, "because I built a place for myself in every room where I was told I didn't." The blonde's lips parted, but no sound came out. "As for what I earned," the woman in orange lifted her phone barely an inch, just enough for everyone to see. "I earned this." A flicker ran through the crowd. "What does that mean?" someone whispered. "Is she making a call?" another murmured. But she only held the phone, untouched, unfazed. "The right to decide who I partner with," she said. "The right to decide where my investments go." With thappins of a get it, a soft intake of breath swept across the ballroom. "And the right," she concluded, "to walk away when respect is absent." The blonde staggered a step backward, her heel scraping against the marble with a squeal that pierced the silence. "You're lying," she snapped, voice fraying at the edges. "You're just trying to scare me." "I don't need fear," the woman replied. "Truth is enough." The blonde's eyes darted across the crowd, pleading for someone, anyone, to stand with her. But support had evaporated. Even the guests who had laughed earlier now stared at her with thinly veiled dread. They could sense the shift. They could smell the unraveling. "You don't know anything about my family," the blonde insisted, her voice climbing. "You're bluffing." The woman in orange took one quiet step forward. "I know," she said gently, "that your family is hanging by a thread. I mighting. I mine mact of is a severus. 1 5 sever Pete." The blonde's face blanched. "And I know," the woman added, "because my team has spent months reviewing the numbers your father hoped no one would ever see." A collective gasp tore through the crowd. Someone dropped a champagne flute. Another stepped back so abruptly his chair toppled. The blonde shook her head violently. No, that's not possible." But the woman in orange wasn't finished. "And I know one more thing," she said, lowering her voice to a calm that sliced through the panic rising around them. "That thread?" She lifted the phone at last. "It breaks tonight." The words "it breaks tonight" didn't crash into the ballroom. They seeped into it, slow and cold, like ink spreading across water. The blonde woman stepped back again, her fingers trembling as they clutched the edge of a nearby chair. The crowd, sensing the shift from confrontation to consequence, drew in tighter. Shoulders narrowed, breaths shortened. Even the violins went silent, bows hovering above strings as if afraid to touch sound. "You're bluffing," the blonde whispered, but it didn't sound like denial anymore. It sounded like someone begging reality to choose a different path. The woman in the orange gown finally touched the screen of her phone. A soft tone chimed, subtle, delicate, impossibly gentle for the destruction it carried. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a man glanced at his phone and went white. Then another, and another. Whispers rolled through the room like a spreading fire. "Is this real? Oh my God, check the numbers. Their stock, look at their stock." The blonde swayed, gripping the chair as if the marble beneath her feet were tilting. What did you do?" she choked out. The woman in orange didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the notifications ignite across the guests' screens, each one a tiny spark marking the unraveling of a dynasty. Finally, she spoke. "I told you," she said calmly. "Respect is the foundation of every partnership, and your family chose arrogance instead." The blonde shook her head violently. No, you can't just. Our deal wasn't finalized. This can't be legal." A dry, humorless laugh escaped a man in a navy tux near the stage. "Oh, it's legal," he murmured. "She's just faster than your lawyers." The blonde spun toward him, eyes blazing with humiliation. "Stay out of this." But he wasn't the only one who understood. Across the room, expressions were changing not out of sympathy, but recognition. The woman in orange didn't just have influence. She held something far rarer in rooms like these: control. She's pulling her capital, someone whispered. Not just capital, another corrected. She's pulling the entire support network. The blonde looked back at the woman in orange, horror dawning in her eyes. You wouldn't, you wouldn't destroy us over this. A long pause followed. The ballroom leaned into it, breathless. This? The woman echoed softly. This wasn't the reason. Her gaze sharpened. It was the reminder. The blonde blinked in confusion, chest rising and falling too quickly. My team's been reviewing your family's numbers for months, the woman said. And what we found wasn't a partnership, it was a trap. A plea for rescue, dressed in luxury and charity. Her voice remained even, almost gentle, a surgeon delivering truth without cruelty. You invited investors to a burning building, she continued. And tonight, you poured gasoline on your own floors. Don't blame me for striking the match. The blonde let out a broken sound, something between a gasp and a sob. My father, she whispered. He's counting on this deal. I know, the woman replied. He shouldn't have counted on your behavior. A ripple of shock tore through the crowd, sharp, electric, undeniable. The blonde's shoulders crumpled. Her confidence, once inflated with privilege, deflated in slow motion. She looked suddenly small, swallowed by the very grandeur she had wielded like a weapon. You don't understand, she whispered. Without this, everything collapses. The woman in orange lifted her eyes, not cold, not triumphant, simply resolved. I understand perfectly, she said. Actions have consequences, even for the privileged. A hush fell so deep it felt like the chandeliers were listening. And if your family wanted mercy, she added, they should have started by giving it. The blonde's knees buckled. A man reached out to steady her, but she shook him off, pride and panic warring in her trembling hands. Across the room, more phones lit up with alerts, stock drops, halted transactions, emergency board meetings. The music had stopped. The air was thick. The woman in orange took one final breath, her face calm, composed, impossibly steady. In 10 minutes, she said quietly, your family's empire will hit the floor as hard as you tried to make me. The blonde choked on her breath. And the only difference, the woman added, turning away at last, is that I won't laugh when it happens. The ballroom was no longer a ballroom. It was a pressure chamber, air thinning, nerves fraying, every heartbeat echoing like a drum beneath the chandelier's muted glow. Guests clutched their phones not out of curiosity now, but out of fear, as if the screens were windows into a world being rewritten in real time. The blonde woman, once the loudest force in the room, looked as if the ground had opened beneath her. Her hands trembled. Her breath came in uneven, rattling pulls. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in disbelief as another wave of notifications lit up across the crowd. A man near the orchestra gasped. They just halted the stock. A woman beside him whispered, look at the investor alert. What does full withdrawal mean? Someone else muttered, it means they're done. Finished. The blonde shook her head so violently, her earrings whipped against her neck. Stop it, she begged. Please stop. You can't do this, you can't. But the woman in the orange gown didn't turn back. She stood with her back to the blonde and faced the room, hands folded loosely in front of her, posture as steady as a monument carved from something older than time itself. And for the first time, the crowd saw her not as a target or an outsider or a curiosity. They saw her as a force, calm, composed, immovable. One of the gala's board members, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a spine that suddenly seemed much less straight, stepped forward. Madam, there must be some mistake, he said, voice cracking despite his attempt at dignity. Our partnership was mutually beneficial. Surely we can discuss. The woman in orange lifted a hand. Just one. The smallest gesture. But it silenced him more effectively than any shout could have. There was nothing mutual, she said quietly. Your family sought to use my resources to mask the truth you've been hiding for years. And sister apt of the race, and if you're coming to heaven. Even bad greater. A ripple of shame passed through several of the board members. They knew. Maybe not all of it, but enough. The blonde's breaths turned shallow. No, 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 you don't understand, she cried. Her voice bounced off the marble, frantic and thin. You're going to destroy everything my father built, everything we've protected, everything we fought to keep alive. The woman in orange finally turned. Not fully, just enough to meet her eyes. You didn't protect anything, she said. You delayed the inevitable and called it victory. Gasps tremored through the guests. And you fought, she added, against the wrong enemy. The blonde's face crumpled in agony. This was just a misunderstanding, just a moment, just a moment? The woman's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You humiliated me publicly, she continued. You tried to strip me of my dignity in front of a crowd. You expected applause. You expected the room to validate you. Her gaze swept the chandeliers, the polished marble, the frozen figures around her. They did. The guests flinched collectively, visibly because the indictment was not hers alone. Then her eyes settled back on the blonde. But this isn't about revenge, she said. It's about integrity. Something your family abandoned long before I walked into this room. Someone from the corner whispered, "She's right." A few others nodded subtly, shame creeping across their necks like a slow stain. The blonde's voice broke. Please, don't ruin us. Please. I shouldn't have said anything. Everyone was watching. I was angry, I didn't mean. You meant every word, the woman in orange replied. And even now, you don't regret what you did. You regret what it cost you. The blonde made a choking sound. Tears finally welled at the corners of her eyes, clinging to her lashes like fragile beads. A murmur swept through the room again, this time softer, almost mournful. Someone near the bar, a woman with a pearl necklace, whispered to her husband, "How many times have we stood by and let this happen?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. A few more guests looked down at their feet, as if recognizing themselves reflected in the blonde's cruelty. The woman in orange lifted her phone once more. A new alert blinked across the screens of several guests simultaneously. Emergency financial announcement from the Hawthorne family. It's happening right now. Oh my God, this is catastrophic. The blonde's knees buckled. She collapsed onto a nearby chair, gripping its edge as if afraid she might slide off the world entirely. What? What will happen to us? She whispered, voice breaking like a child's. The woman in orange paused. And for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in her gaze. Not pity, not softness, but recognition. You built your identity on exclusion, she said. You built your power on assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. Her voice lowered. And you believed you were untouchable. The blonde looked up at her, eyes raw. I was wrong. The woman nodded once. Yes, she said. And now the world sees it too. The blonde shook her head slowly, disbelief turning into desperation. Is there anything I can do? The woman in orange looked at her with a stillness that felt ancient. You could start, she said softly, by listening. The blonde blinked, confused. Listening to what? The woman in orange turned away, her gown shimmering like a flame moving through the broken air. To the silence, she said. The chandeliers flickered. The music stopped entirely. And for the first time all night, the blonde heard it. The sound of a room that no longer belonged to her. The woman in orange stepped forward, and the crowd instinctively parted, forming a quiet corridor of widened eyes and held breaths. She paused midway, turning just enough so her voice carried across the marble. You asked who belongs here, she said. So let me answer clearly. She lifted her phone, its screen glowing with the final confirmation from her team. Power belongs to those who treat others with dignity. And tonight, that wasn't your family. Then she walked on, her heels echoing like a verdict no one dared challenge. By the time she reached the exit, the final alerts hit every phone in the ballroom, markets halted, credit lines frozen, the Hawthorne empire collapsing in real time. Gasps rippled behind her, followed by a hush thick enough to feel. The blonde sat motionless, eyes vacant, realizing the world she ruled had vanished in minutes. The woman in orange didn't look back. She stepped into the night air, calm, steady, unshaken. Some storms roar. Others walk away and let the consequences speak for them.